Thank you very much. This applause is really encouraging because we definitely need so for this panel, right? We have to speak about economy and various influences of economic development and in environments for democracy, for election outcome, for the influence of people thinking. And in the last 1.5 days, we've already talked a lot about politics and a lot about law and major processes we are witnessing our life, like climate change and changing social relations and big, deep changes. So now we have to see something which is also deep and also fast and quickly changing. I would like to start a little bit from 2008, because I am very concerned that a lot of politics which we are witnessing, including this country in Europe and the rest of the world, was deeply influenced by the crisis of 2008. A lot of things have changed since then. We already forgot it. It was 15 years ago, right? And there was a lot of learning processes, a lot of interesting insight the world has learned, and some things were changed and maybe corrected, and some others were probably not so much. But we are still witnessing the influences of the 2008 crisis. So if I believe that the main economic steps, the post-2008 crisis was a kind of long pro-growth logic in economic governance, keeping the interest rates law, inflation law, which after a while actually, according to economic logic, should have led to inflation. But it actually did not happen for a while because of the global economy could moderate very well, and the flexible labor forces could actually balance pretty well the inflation. This has changed by the end of the 2010s, and monetary politics started to change globally, included the Fed, which is very important for all of us. Economy seemed to go back to normal. However, we can see that there was a fascinating correction and a significant growth in the 2010s, even in Hungary, where the crisis in 2008 was really very deep. There was an unprecedented growth we witnessed in the 2010s, and it was mainly not because of local governance, but also because of the global processes. Central and Eastern Europe as such witnessed a 4 to 6% growth, which was higher than the EU average. So this was quite a nice decade, actually. But a lot of things has changed since then, right? First, there was also time for change. So this very low inflation or negative inflation period could not be maintained for long. But also we had COVID with very, very radical influences on our economy. And also we had the war in our neighborhood, Russia against Ukraine, which created a huge energy crisis. So then last year we already saw a huge inflation, which was really out of our scope for many, many years. So this is now looks better, but for example in Hungary it doesn't look much better because we are still like I think 12%. It's going down, but 12% is still significant compared to like the 2-3%, which probably is kind of targeted by major monetary institutions. So is this a correct view or not? And where are we? So I'd like to ask Piergiuseppe to start. You see the whole world in an economic comparison. So where are we? Are we happy, or is it getting better, or so? What do you think?
Thank you very much, Zsuzsanna. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and thank you to the organizer to be part of this very interesting and timely forum, I would say. Let me step back as well, as you did, back to 2009, exactly, right? After the global financial crisis, we had this very important G20 meeting in London. It was April 2009, where the global leaders, the most important global leaders, was Sarkozy at the time, Cameron was the prime minister in UK, were announcing this new strategy for building back better. The claim was we understood the mistake that led to the global financial crisis, so we want a more resilient global economy to grow up. And therefore, this would mean and would entail increased space for fiscal expenditure, fight against inequality, and we know inequality was one of the root causes of the expansion of subprime mortgages and therefore of the crisis, and on the other hand, the regulation of the financial market, which were met with unregulated after the early 90s, let's say. These last very few months. Actually, the next G20 that was held in Canada the year after, in 2010, in Ottawa, changed completely the point of view of the global community. Business as usual, in a sense, was back in town, especially in the form of fiscal austerity. And this was the scenario which led a few months later, in 2011, to the crisis of the restructuring of the debt, this bloody restructuring of the debt in Greece, overseen by the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. So the growth that we experienced was a growth which was favored, of course, by very low interest rate for an extraordinarily prolonged period of time, but was a growth which was a bit inflated, was more a growth in asset prices rather than in economic fundamentals as productivity or wage. Real and nominal wage were stagnating in most of the European countries, and was a very fragile global economy. High levels of inequality, very high level of indebtedness, despite no lesson in a sense was learned by the crisis. There was a sort of shift of debt from privately owned debt to publicly owned debt, was exploding debt in developing countries and in many advanced economies. Italy, my own country, is cursed by very high, for example, GDP debt, that it was unable to reduce that debt during those years. So when the COVID-19 shock hit this economy, it was already a very fragile economy. The growth that we experienced was not a deeply rooted and sustainable economic growth, in a sense, and the economic was very fragile. Now, when in 2021 we started getting out from the COVID-19 crisis, one thing happened. Global value chains were still under pressure, and therefore there was a mismatch between demand and supply. And these gave start to the rise in prices that we call inflation. So the inflation episodes, which then exploded 1 year later because of the conflict in Ukraine and the pressure on critical commodity markets and food and energy, started well before, in the second half of 2021. Now, what was the reply? And now we come to the policy question of main central banks in Europe, so the European central banks, and not only the European central banks, but for the euro area. Of course, the Christine Lagarde-led institution is the main responsible, but also the Fed in the US and other central banks, where the reply in my books and in the books of my organization, of UNCTAD, was very disappointing. The reply was, what was the reply? An interest rate hike. Now, the root causes of the inflation were not the same of the 70s, where after the two oil shocks, there was a spiral, wage price spiral, which was leading to hyperinflation. In that case, cooling down the economy was a reply. In this case, the root causes of inflation were bottlenecks and pressure to global value chains, and the situation of food and energy markets. And the third main reason, and we have very conclusive data on that, was the profiteering behavior of many multinational corporations in markets which were extremely concentrated, much more concentrated than back in the 70s. Now, what you do cooling down the economy with high interest rate in this case is not, of course, what we would call in neoclassical economics a first best reply. And it's like the famous story says, no, when the only thing that you have in your hands is a number, so everything looks like a nail. And the central banks, that is my impression, look at the interest rate, it was their only instrument that they have, their hammer, and they started sneezing this nail, trying to cooling down the economy. Now, the good thing is that this was not entirely successful, that is, the economy has not cooled down as it could have been, and actually, despite a growth which is a low growth, it's 2.4% growth, which is one of the lowest growth rates in the last 40 years at the global level, outside plain regression, we still have positive growth, but the consequences for countries, especially for fragile economies, the one with high levels of debt, were terrible, because high interest rate means the first impact of high interest rates for this economy is high cost of servicing debt. Some economies are spending 50% of revenues in just cost for servicing debts. And this means squeezing the fiscal space that the economy needs for social security, for education, for healthcare. And at the end of the day, it's what they need on which their legitimacy rests. So we are putting under serious strife and pressure democracy and states and governments. Now, what is the scenario? And I conclude with this. What is the prospects for the future? What is the second part of your question? Well, I think, despite all of talk that we have about China, China will grow not at 5% level, which is its target, but, according to our latest estimation in our latest trade and development report, around 4.5%, which is 10 times the growth rate that Europe will experience. So the real segment to look for the global economy, it's this continent, it's Europe. Growth rate of 0.4% at the global level, which is almost stagnation, plain regression in the largest economy of the bloc, which is Germany. Now, what we need policy to come out from this situation, especially we think at Ankter we need two kind of policy, more public investment, which is one of the great drag to economic growth in the European Union, different from the US and China from a certain point of view, where this policy space it's higher, and restructuring the production structure in order to get high productivity, higher wage growth, which is dragging economic growth in Europe. We will have the opportunity of doing so. Well, this is, however, a big question which is still open. Maybe we can try to address this question in the panel. I just conclude my kickoff intervention with 2 points, which are my main worry for this political capacity of the continent to be able to enact and craft those policies that we desperately need at this point to have a resilient and sustainable growth. The first one is that with respect to the 70s, I was mentioning this, the global markets, the critical global markets, food, energy, digital markets, are extremely concentrated. Level of concentration which were unprecedented in the history of modern economic history. And this means that private companies are getting more and more powerful. And this leads to a risk of what we call regulatory capture. That is the fact that these big companies with a lot of power and a lot of say, even in democratic process, can somehow skew the legislative to have more favorable conditions. This is what Luigi Zingales, which is a very famous Italian economist, which is director of the Booth Economic School at the Chicago University, is calling Medici's vicious cycle. The fact that if I get more market power, I get more money, and with this money I can get more lobby power, and so increase even more through regulation, through regulatory capture my advantage. This is first shadow that I see is cast on the union. And the second one, I think, is it comes from what's happened in the period that we called hyper-globalization in the last 30 years. In the last 30 years, what we have been witnessing, it's basically a shift of policy responsibility from democratic elected bodies to independent bodies and technocratic authorities. Europe is the chief case in point, but WTO at the global level, a lot of area which were under the capacity of national bodies to take a decision upon now have been basically taken away from their responsibility. This, of course, that some authors have defined as a democratic backslash in traditional liberal democracy, is an additional burden. That is, we lost part of the capacity that we have, and therefore it's something that really worries me. Thanks.
Wow. Well, that was really quite comprehensive and quick. So I would like to ask Michael, maybe to comment on this before we go to the political implications. Because, so what do you, I think, what do you think as a kind of major issues of fragility at the moment? Because as I understood, and especially in Europe, right, we are in a critical position compared to some parts of the world. While there are other parts of the world which are also pretty fragile. But now we try to keep on our eyes on Europe. So where do you see these sources of fragility?
Well, let me first say also thank you for my part. Is this on? Yes.
Yeah, you should get close.
Very close.
Almost
That's
eat
better.
it.
Yes. Thank you for my part of being able to be part of this panel. And usually my friends say I talk too fast. But next to an Italian, I appear probably very slow. And so that's a win for me already. And thank you also, Piergiuseppe, for this very detailed recap of the last 15 years. And it really reminded me of myself. I started studying when this happened, and we talked about this every day. And every step of it, and people actually tend to forget where we came from, and especially politicians also tend to forget this whole economic story and also the repercussions of it, because as you said, And we always think this is a really good story, we're in a good situation, and growth is back, but distribution didn't change, and growth is in Europe actually relatively low. And if you at last saw this graph compared to the actual growth in the US in the past 20 years compared to the European growth, and it's completely detached from it, right? So this understanding that we have a huge problem in Europe for a long time, and that it has to do with public investment levels, everything, I totally agree with. And at the same time, since my organization is also doing policy advice and talks to politicians, right? And when it comes to inflation, and the best example is my home country, Austria, where when we had this debate in terms of inflation happened, and it was really big, really high in Austria. We had the highest level in Western Europe, and it's still among the highest. Like we are above the EU average right now. And it was that they said, well, it's not really. Is it really a problem? We're so rich. And then there was a debate about how poor people are actually in the country, and there was a disagreement, and you had conservative journalists really being baffled that it's actually a couple of thousand, or like 10,000s of kids who live in poverty in Austria. So this understanding that we're actually not having that equal society as we believe to be really came out of the situation. And I think inflation, as you've seen it in the past, that what the real danger here is, right? It is one that goes against social cohesion at a really fundamental level. But what it literally means, since inflation, the effects of it are socially unequal, right? That means that it's really tougher for poor people to fight off inflation, especially if wages don't increase. Why? Because they need to spend more on energy and food and housing. And these were the ones that drove it, right? So in this kind of situation of high inflation in these areas, it will really hit back onto the low income, poorer, and lower middle class, so to say. And we know from history that if the governments fail to really address this, and inflation creeps actually into the middle class, this is the danger, right? Because these are the groups who usually are centrist, who have like regular beliefs, who might have voted for centrist parties, and might vote for more radical parties, for instance, who think that the system doesn't deserve them anymore. And this is the second part I want to make, and this is based on the work also we're doing at the FAS, and that this understanding of, even in consolidated democracies, so where institutions are still in place, where elections are in place, and you can take Germany or others forward, that the influence in terms of what policies are made on a legislative level is also socially unequal in sense. There was a big study where it measured the responsiveness of the system towards preferences that the lower middle class had if they were different to the richer class. And you actually find it in the past 20, 30 years that it tends to favor what the rich want. So you maybe do some tax cuts for assets or in financial markets, which we know only 10% of people actually own, but you would reduce social spending. So the hard sphere program, for instance, there was never a public majority for this. This was a government decision which I believed it was necessary to do, and this comes back when you talk to social democrats, especially when they say, why are we not believed anymore by certain groups who used to vote for us? So this understanding, and it's really interesting because when we started 4 or 5 years ago, and we said when you talk about democracy, we should talk about inequality and inflation. Inflation wasn't a topic, but especially inequality. In many of these international public policy circles, and especially in Brussels, there was often met with, really does it have to do with that? Isn't it just a question of rights and rule of law? Because that dominated the discourse. And we say, well, I think you underestimate this. And if you don't do this, this is really crucial for understanding of why certain groups in society tend to go away, lose trust in the system, and then vote for different parties. And I think the Polish PiS election, when they came in power, it was 10 years ago or something like this, this understanding that it had to do with social policy in terms of that they actually also distributed money, so to say, for groups who weren't receiving social policy before, rural mothers especially. Just the economic side of it was often, at least I met back in the day that, I didn't know that, really? Okay, there might have been a difference if that these 5% had actually voted for peace. And then they're not nationalists, so to say, right? They didn't vote for immigration, but they voted for this. And if it's tied to, when the previous governments, progressive governments, didn't do that, and you lose the social question to the right, then This, in my view, often also kind of is a missing element in terms of understanding why certain populist, especially right-wing populist groups, are winning over time. And the Austrian case right now is the same one, that the far right is actually polling at 30% in the #1 place, and it has to do with the government performance in actually meeting these economic hardships as of now. And this is a relative question, right? It's not about that so many people are now poor in Austria, it's about if they feel actually left out. Yeah, so this would be some remarks in terms of where we are from that point of view.
Yes, of course. I mean, this is super interesting. And now I would like to turn to Daphne. So what is important for people when they go to vote, right? How far, I mean, these are just very basic political questions. Do they go after money or do they go after ideological messages? Or who do they compare their status? When we speak about inequality, what does exactly means? You know, it's so subjective. People, before they go to vote, they never see comparative international databases. They don't know what are the poverty threshold. They have no idea. But they exactly know whether they are poor or not so poor. And usually they see themselves more poor than what they are, even in Austria and in rich countries. So it's what are the important factors we have to look when people go to vote and they make their choices?
Super. Can you hear me? Does this work? Yeah, perfect. Oh, I don't need it because I'm going to speak loudly anyway, but let's hope. So thank you, first to say, thank you very much for having me here. I'm really glad to be on this panel. Just a short disclaimer, so I'm a political scientist and I'm also a comparativist, which means that I basically compare countries, and what I'd like to offer here today is a bit the comparative perspective. So voting and far-right voting, populist voting across different countries in Europe. And in doing so, in the next few minutes that I have, I would like to agree but also disagree a little with some of the points that my co-panelists have made. So you asked about voting, right? Exactly what I like to talk about. So let me just start by saying, and it's a pity I can't show you a really lovely graph that I had, but the format doesn't allow. So I'm on this team with another 7 political scientists, comparativists, and we just very recently published the 3rd version of our database, The Populist, which essentially classifies far-right, far-left populist parties in Europe that have made it into parliament since 1989. And one staggering, I would say, result that we found is that last year in a national election, 32% of European voters cast their ballots for umbrella anti-establishment party. That includes far-right, far-left and populist parties, 32%. That is compared to 22% in the early 2000s and 12% in the early 1990s. Now that says a lot, right? Because that means 1/3 of the European electorate opts for an anti-establishment party. That is big. That also has significant political implications because some of these parties, once in power, they erode democratic norms. They vote, they make sure that they are very resilient and that their policies and that themselves are going to stay there. And it's very important for the erosion of democratic rights, broadly speaking. Now, obviously, I hope I have your interest here. Now you're going to ask me about why is that happening and is the economy a part of that? And I would say absolutely. The very short answer is yes. But I think we need a more nuanced perspective than some of the ideas that have been put forward. Why? Let's start again with Zsuzsanna's 2008 economic crisis. What is interesting about looking at the economic crisis at the macro level is that you will see that some of these macro indicators do not correlate with far-right party or populist party support across Europe. I was, as a Greek-born person, very interested to see that in the aftermath of the economic crisis, we had the rise of the Golden Dawn, a neo-Nazi party, and yet Spain and Portugal had no far-right at the same time. We also saw earlier on in countries such as the Netherlands that had quite significant economic stability and even fairly stable patterns of migration have far-right with initially Pim Fortuyn and then, Geert Wilders, the PVV. So if you look at macro-level indicators, they don't necessarily correlate. What does that mean? Does that mean the economy is not relevant? No, that's not what it means. It means we need to look more specifically into the micro-level, parts of what Michael just noted about how specific inequalities and how particular economic policies affect and marginalize certain social groups. So let me give you some examples now from my research about the kinds of people that vote for populist and far-right, particularly populist parties that erode democracy, right? So the way I like to conceptualize it in my research is to basically distinguish between what we call the core and the peripheral voters. The core voters are ideological, which comes to your question. They are really voters that are driven by nationalist concerns. They are concerned about the cultural erosion of their country, their cultural norms, their national identity. These are not necessarily voters who are affected by the economy. They vote for the far right because they support the far right. It is a vote of confidence for the far right. Interestingly, however, and contrary to a lot of what we think we might know about these voters, they're a very small group. So numerically, they don't make the 40 and 50 and 35% that a lot of these parties are making. We need to then move on and to look at the peripheral voters, those voters who are driven by grievances. These could be economic grievances. These could also be trust-related grievances. They could be grievances about welfare provision, grievances about various inequalities that drive that make people particularly precarious. So within this peripheral group, we have distinguished in our research, for example, we like to label our voters because I think that makes it easier to relate to. We have the materialists. These are voters that are driven broadly by materialist concerns. So they might be very worried about the materialist dimension of immigration, for example. So we hear immigration and immediately you're going to tell me, oh, but that's a cultural issue. No, it isn't. There's a lot of voters that have been convinced that somehow immigrants are competitors for them in the labor market. Immigrants are a problem for them to access jobs, to access labor provisions, right? So these materialists have broad economic concerns. They are the welfareists, those who basically are, have particular insecurity. So we looked at in our research, for example, at people who are unemployed, individuals in large families, people who may be sick or disabled and cannot work, and those people who are affected by limited welfare provisions and therefore are insecure. They're also the decliners, people who fall from, so intergenerational social mobility plays a huge role. People who believe, and this is very much also a subjective story, right? People who have fallen and therefore believe that they are lower than they should be. And also the distrustful voters, those voters who are concerned about, broadly speaking, democratic institutions, fearing that these institutions do not deliver on their social contract obligations. There's one more thing we haven't spoken about, I will very briefly mention it here, which is access to housing. This is big, and remember me, it's going to be bigger. In Germany already, there's a huge discussion about housing, but I know we talked about it in Slovenia when we were there a few months ago. In the UK, which is where I live and work, there is a huge problem of access to housing, both in terms of how much rents have increased, but also in terms of being able to buy a house for people of our generation. So we're not just talking simply about the people who are severely marginalized in society, but we're also talking about large numbers of middle-class people who cannot, because of inflation, because of inequality, because of various economic concerns, access basic public provisions. I'll leave it here because I think we had a question about whether we can counter this, but I'll leave it for after. Yeah,
thank you. It's really interesting, and of course, well, there were so many issues you brought up. It's difficult to choose one of them. I would like to come to the institutions and elected and technocratic institutions and ratios at some point, but maybe now. So can the anti-establishment parties, which is like 30%, more than 30% in these days, cater for these lots of different voters who are disappointed, and with what? So it's still, my question is still whether this is, you can help or gain their voters and maintain their voters. We know it from Hungary. I mean, if we follow your analysis, then it's Viktor Orban who is actually the perfect governor, because he does actually serve all he fulfills all these roles, you know. He provides proudness, he provides money for those who vote for him, so at some bunch of certain strata of society, certain groups of the society, so they can, many of the anti-establishment party can actually not just pull the periphery voters to them, and also obviously part of the core, but maintain those voters. I mean, we sometimes discuss, you know, newly autocratizing countries, or some countries which are regarded proper democracies but still use illiberal practices here and there, as you said, you know, just undermine democratic rules, the weakening institutions. So there are plenty of ways how to do democratic backlash. You don't have to be hungry to witness this phenomena. So what political parties can go for then? So really, it's too many things what you said. You know, we still have to figure out which way do we want to go. So what is your proposal from the United Nations environment? When
my proposal, I don't speak for the United Nations.
Okay, well, we look for your proposal as a smart intellectual economist.
Thank you very much. You're too kind with me, but it's already difficult to find normal in agreement within the 191 countries of the United Nations. You can imagine that in this period, it's even more difficult
we are in Europe,
to find a common proposal. We can squeeze a bit. Thank you very much for the question. Just two quick things before, just to reply to my my fellow panelists. The first one, it's about inflation. Inflation, it's a very complex phenomenon, because it's true that somehow, precisely because the basket of goods that poorest part of the population usually is exposed to is different from the one of the richest one. So when inflation especially comes from food and energy prices, it is biased against the poorest part of the population. But it's also true that the other part of the population which pay high price from inflation are this very tiny part of the population which are the owner of fixed income assets, which are losing a lot of their, and that's what the story of the Silicon Valley Bank in the US, it's a story of fixed income asset devaluation. So the kind of coalition to fight for and against inflation can be not as easy to read as it could seem. So the question here becomes not whether or not to address inflation, but how to address inflation. And I think that, which is related to the question of what inflation we fight. Because there is certain inflation which is somehow normal in capitalistic economy, the one that comes from wage growth. Even more. I think it depends on the country. An advanced economy growing at relatively lower than developing countries could bear for me an inflation of 4 or 5%, while developing economies could deal with an inflation of 10-15%. Of course, when we look at hyperinflation like in the 80s in Latin America, or when we took to the Weimar Republic in Germany in the 30s, with $1 billion increase in the price of one pound of bread, that's a completely different story. But when it comes now to fight...
In Europe, it's the 2%. The ECB is...
The ECB, I think, in my opinion, that target is an excessive target. I think because it comes from a vision about this story of this trade-off between unemployment and inflation, which is a vision that many studies dispute and many conclusive studies dispute. And I think that over-attention on inflation is one of the reasons why, for example, we didn't pay that much attention to increase inequality. And we accept the fact that wage growth has been basically absent in the last 30 years. The share of global value going to labor vis-a-vis capital is reduced by 10%, which is huge transfer of resources. So there is part of inflation which is, I would say, healthy in capitalist economy, and we have to understand what are the sources of inflation and how to fight them. Fighting inflation, cooling down the economy with the interest rate when inflation is coming from for price-setting mechanisms in specific markets, I think it's a dangerous move. Coming to Daphne, and it's very interesting. A reading, actually, I was working, and I have a couple of papers using also your data from the populists. So I'll thank you for the work you and your colleagues do on that. Indeed, it's interesting because either looking at data on populism, either through votes share. So, for example, there is this fabulous data set that Moritz Schurek and his co-authors have built in the last few years. They look at the time span of populism leader in power. More or less, you get the same kind of results. And what you notice is that you have an historical spike populist rules right now, which is comparable only to what it happened in the mid-30s in Europe. And you know that this was paving the way to Nazism in Germany and to fascism in Italy, among other things. Another thing which is important to say, it's about the relationship between inequality and populist party. The first populist party which consciously was populist, was self-defining populist, was the American Populist Party. That was created in the end of the 19th century, in the middle of the gold standard, which is a system of international ruling of trade and finance, which is pretty similar to the hyper-globalization regimes that we had, and was a response of a coalition of farmers and workers to the increasing levels of inequality, the Gilded Age of Mark Twain of that years. Last thing I want to say before coming to your question is this identity economy debate, which I agree with Daphne, it's completely misplaced from a lot of different perspectives. The interesting question is, what is the source of shock which lead to tension and malcontent? And if you look to Europe, for example, it is clear how certain country, which is the one which has been more exposed to financial shocks, like the famous PIGS, Italy, Greece, Spain, have been developing form of populist party, which is more on the left side, which advance a proposal to reform the financial system and increase equality. Like, for example, in Spain, the first populist party was Podemos in the early 2000s. In Italy, we have the five-star movements. In Greece, it was the Tsirpas. While countries like France, like Germany, have been developing a populist proposal more on the right wing because the shock that was most felt was the one coming from immigration. And was a different kind of immigration. For example, if you compare Spain with France, immigration is less felt in Spain, even if the share of immigrants is even higher than in France, because most are Spanish-speaking, coming from Latin America, was not the Arab coming from the Northern African Arab countries. So that's important nuances that have to be taken into account. Coming to your question, can this anti-establishment movement kind of take on board this demand of change by part of the population and offer some kinds of reply? I'm a bit pessimistic on that, this specific movement for the way they are, on the way in which it's basically on the definition that we have of populist or anti-establishment movement, which is the definition that most people use, is the one of Kasmat, which is political scientist in the US. It's basically about a strategy. It's telling a story about a contraposition between the elite and the mass of the people. And it's a communication strategy. It's not a political read. I think that the good thing of having this explosion, in a sense, is that we are all understanding that there are big problems in the system that we have set. And therefore, we need to build a new narrative to reply to this demand, which are normal. When inequality is high, it's a problem. And one of the ways in which I think it's it could be very productive to look at it is the way in which Danny Roderick, which is an Turkish-American economist, is speaking about this trilemma, which is the one I think that we are facing. It's really true. That is the fact that we cannot have, at the same time, open international markets on many fronts, national sovereignty, and democracy. So either we have to give up some of them, okay? To the moment, what we are doing is giving up democracy. It's what I was telling you before. Now, during the hyper-globalization, we were basically outsourcing a lot of policy decisions to independent body in order to keep a certain level of sovereignty together with maximizing market openness. This model is failing, and this is price that we are paying. So we can choose. Either we go towards a renounce of sovereignty in an expanded democratic global community, which is extremely difficult to envisage right now, but in a sense is what European Union was intended to do, or we go towards another model, which is a less globalized model, less is more, in a sense, a thinner globalization, in which we recover democratic stance and voice on policy dimension like intellectual property rights, investments that to the moment have been, in most cases, outsourced. And, of course, the price that we pay is that we will face more barrier in international markets.
So then what, right? Because this model is really worrisome. So I see actually we are going backwards in terms of globalization as well, and democracy as well. So maybe sovereignty is the only thing which is thriving in these days. Is this the way where the world is going? I'm also asking this. No, Daphne, you don't agree with this. No. Okay, so why not?
Sorry, thanks. Yeah, sorry, I emphatically said no there, and I think I'll be quick because I want to engage the audience and I want to hear from Michael too. But the reason I'm saying that is there's one thing we haven't talked about, and that is the supply side, and that is the fact that we actually have agency. If we look at things as only and merely the outcome of particular structures, which that does play a role, but we talk about big things, the economy, globalization, etc. But we forget it also matters what other parties are doing, how other politicians, how other groups compete, and also what we do to make policies, what we do having agency. We can reverse this scenario. It's not an irreversible trend that there is nothing we can do about it and then we just have to live with it and that's the end of it because the structures are going that way. We have agency. So what should we do in my view, and that's not my personal opinion, I like to, when I speak in public, I like to do it based on the research, the evidence-based research that I've done. And I think that what my research sort of points to is two things. I think, parties, the other parties that compete with the populist parties, I just want to make a very small little parenthesis here and say that I would also argue strongly that I think populism is a threat to democracy wherever it comes from, whether it comes from the right or the left or the center, wherever it comes from.
Out of the blue, right?
Sorry?
Out of the blue. Some of the populists is not ideological.
Maybe they're not ideological, but I think the reason for that is because populism is essentially an ideology that places the will of the people as the only way to make legitimate and moral decisions in society. Ultimately, that excludes certain groups. Wherever that comes from, there is a them, there is an enemy, and they are excluded from any type of decision making. So if we take, say, William Riker's definition of populism as a collective way of making decisions in society, as a vision of how to make decisions in society, and say that any minority is excluded, that has a danger for eroding democracy, regardless of where it comes from. So I don't think, and my research suggests, that we should not fight populists by becoming populist. We shouldn't say, oh, look, the populist message is really, really attractive, therefore we're going to copy it, but we're just going to do it from the other side of the political spectrum. A problem in our democracies, I think, is even deeper seated than populism. It is the deeply seated political polarization. Even if you go on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, right, all you see is people ranting at each other. You're left, no, you're right, no, you're this, no, you're that. It's just a lot of hatred. There's a lot of polarization. There is a lot of, instead of consensus building. So I think that that is a big problem. How can we have democratic norms if we actually don't accept the very basic democratic norm of consensus building and accepting minorities and other people to express views, right? So I think that we have agency. We should not copy the populists. We should try to focus, to have a positive message about empowering these groups that I talked about earlier, that are insecure, that are affected economically and politically and socially in so many ways. And we need to do that through a very consensus-based understanding of how our democracies need to look like. Thank you.
Michael?
Yeah, just to reply to some of the things that have been said. I usually, well, a week ago or 2 weeks ago, we were in Sweden and it was members of parliament from all over Europe, and we did a workshop on how to fight the far-right narrative, like what you should respond in this environment, right? That, which I fully agree, it's actually one that's so unconducive to democracy because it's dominated by polarization, social media, disinformation, and especially that what the right managed to do to introduce this narrative of it's an elite pushing through policies for minorities against the will of the people, right? And it was puzzling to see we did this workshop because there was a demand from the progressive side of it. They actually are in this position themselves. They don't really know what to do. And first thing we did is that you really have to understand like how they win. As you said, it's a communication strategy in a world which is working different to 20 years ago, where you did op-eds in the paper. No, you have to win the social media game. You have to fight disinformation, you fake news and everything. So, and the adaptation to this, which favored the far right so far, hasn't worked yet, right? So this is that what I call the discursive kind of sphere in what's going on. And we have to understand that, and there's different policies to do that, right? And the other is what we usually call the structural arguments, like what's the right policies to fight for inflation, or debate about what globalization we want to live in. And this is what we obviously should want to talk about, because this is what would solve the problems. But we're not in this realm. We are in this discursive realm where it's there's no debate, you just are either or camps, no gray and whatsoever. And the response in the workshop, right, at least and also the experts we invited who do that and analyze this all the time, is like, well, in that environment you also have to put a narrative forward, right? And there it started. You had progressive MPs from all over Europe, and you would think they have a common narrative. They don't. They're really fractured, and you just saw it in the recent Slovak election, how different fractured it is. And it took them a long time to agree on a certain common frame, and then it's about equality, about solidarity, and all these things. But when you come down to that, you need a playbook you have to run in the 2 seconds, in the 30 seconds you have on TV or on social media. This is not necessarily there. And I truly believe that you have to get right. Otherwise, you don't enter the discourse. And what I also believe, that kind of narrative, and that includes all progressive forces, it definitely has to define the community in the sense of who are they making politics for, in a much more inclusive way, right? It must be a story about we actually need every one of you to make this happen. And then it includes people from different skills, a working class, entrepreneurs, research, minority groups, right? This common idea of we are citizens in a state, right? And we know in the progressive side, they also tend to now fracture themselves and cater to their own group, right? But in the end of the day, in democracy, it's about winning elections. It's about getting a majority. And this is what I believe can be, yes, to some degree detached from the structural arguments, as long as you're in a discursive environment where we just respond to narratives going out and reply to it. And because the last remark when we talked to one MP and asked him, can you say that in 2 sentences? And he's like, why are you never talking about your own ideas? And then he answered, yeah, because when I talk about my ideas, it's always long and boring. And I mean, this is the problem, right? It's like if you don't manage to say this in a few sentences, but you want to make this elaborate argument, and this is something on the progressive side that happens a lot, and we included in this, right? Then you don't get there. And these skills, only now you see in this initiative, at least in my work, right? We should have done this 10 years, 15 years ago. And now we're just realizing this. So maybe just, that would be one idea.
Okay, well, this is a very rich discussion with very many openings. So I would like to open the floor, so offer you the opportunity to question or comment. I would like to keep a little bit on the economic thing, because it's very tempting to speak about politics, but we are supposed to speak about, how the economy influencing political changes, and of course the narrative question is super important, especially if we see that there are various groups of people who are going to the, let's call it anti-establishment, whoever they are, whether populist or far right. So I think I just use it as a kind of working format for everything which is other than the mainstream political forces which were leading the European scene in the last decade. So let's call them anti-establishment parties. So as Daphne demonstrated, there are various reasons behind they are turning away from these parties. And we are trial and error, right? And on what is a good economy, so which provides a really good background for further development and maintaining growth in let's call in Europe. So how far this institutional competition, which you raised earlier, between the non-elected bodies like national banks and governments, or international organizations, international regulatory organizations, and states. There are a lot of conflicts in these days. This is also related to, the question of the future of Europe. So what remains in sovereign hand? So it's both international level question and also within the country. I mean, we know quite a lot about this in Hungary, because this autocratic government has a critical dominance over the national bank in Hungary. So the independence of the national bank has been in question for a while. But it is a question, and your comment seemed also kind of, questioning whether the authority of the non-elected bodies is really so important. But is it a dangerous field, right? Because if you only go after the elected bodies, then that we can go really in trouble, as many democratically elected political forces could successfully create non-democracy from their states. So there is a reason why there are technocratic bodies which are balanced, and these are parts of the checks and balances of a system. So why are you so critical towards the technocrats?
Thank you very much. This reminds me of a friend of mine that reading my article said, well, it's funny. It's a technocrat criticizing technocracy. Because strictly speaking, being an economist at UN, I am a technocrat. Look, let me start in this way. Economy, maybe non-economists do not know, but economy is not the set of universal ideas which apply in all the contexts. The economy is much more like a set of different models which can apply in different contexts. So it's not that an economic model or certain economic set of consistent ideas, which are consistent, always works. And I think that in the 70s and in the 80s, when we started the discussion about, for example, the independence of the central bank, we were coming out from a period of hyperinflation. We solved that problem, and the economic was on buoyant growth, the global economy. And in that case, in a sense, outsourcing the monetary policy decision to central bank was a good idea. I'm not sure that in a world which is completely different to what it was the world in the 80s, that very same model is still working. And the way in which central bankers acted during the recent crisis, which was, in my opinion, very myopic and very dangerous, and it led to the birth of crisis a lot of developing economies, because we are speaking about Europe, but looking outside Europe and looking to Pakistan, to Egypt, for example, we can see the price, the cost of the interest rate hikes in Europe and US, and the change on exchange rate markets has been used. So the question is that model still working? And if we want to go beyond central bank, I think here we live in a bit. There was a famous article a few years ago on foreign policy about the crisis of liberal democracy. And the crisis of liberal democracy was pointing more in the direction of the crisis of liberalism in illiberal democracy. I'm thinking to Erdogan in Turkey, or thinking to Modi in India. The fact that autocrats, democratically elected autocrats, then tend to, for example, impede check and balances. So cut on check and balances, so making the state less liberal. But in the parallel way, I think that in many Western economies, it's the democracy which is in danger, because precisely what we have done is keeping our liberal bodies, thank God, but many of the democratic decisions which were taken democratically before are not more taken in that way. And this is creating a sort of problem.
Like which one?
Like, for example, a decision on intellectual property rights, like the investment decision. You see what's international investment tribunals. Argentina was no more since the early 2000s able to take decision on what foreign investment were doing in their country. That was completely outsourced. Like in Europe, a lot of decisions are taken by the Commission, but it's enormous. You can take the democratic policy space now with respect to the late of the 90s, it's enormously reduced. Now, is this good or is this bad? That's the question. I think we probably went too far, and precisely because we went too far, we have experienced the rise of populist movements, which are a problem, because we do not offer a solution, but they are stressing the fact that we are living in a society in which inequality has been enormously increasing. Wage growth has been repressed, and there is huge malcontent. So that's a signal. So how do we want to reply to that? I think that one of the things is that recovering a bit of democratic space. I think it's extremely important. The second thing, which is building a story, a new narrative, which Michael was mentioning, I think it's extremely important. And from the economy point of view, this means changing the distribution of the value addition in a substantial way, which is not through taxation and the distribution. It is through industrial policy. I need to change the way in which the bargaining power of labor against capital, because again, we are witnessing, we are in a world in which the level of concentration and the level of inequality are unprecedented, and this is creating the problem. I'm finalizing, my last point is this, the third point, the third leg that we need is what Jack Sullivan is the advisor for industrial policy of President Joe Biden, and he's speaking about this idea of, which I found in principle very attractive. He called it high fences for small stakes. It is, we need to defend and we need to be able to do it. That's why the WTO is struggling right now, because of the position of the US, among other things, on certain strategic areas which are important for us, for our national security, like artificial intelligence, like digital markets. We need to be able to do whatever we want, to keep a domestic space, a domestic policy space which we do not more have. I think that is questionable while the stakes are really little in the case of what Joe Biden administration is doing, but I think the idea is precisely that one. It is what, when I was referring to a thinner globalization and to recover democratic policy space, I'm just going in the direction of small stake, high fences for small stakes.
Okay, I'm still looking for comments or questions from the floor. Okay, please go ahead. We have a question here. Please, yeah.
Yeah, just one question. We talked a lot about economy.
Can you tell me where are you from?
Yeah, I'm Pietro Rio from Eurocities, a city network based in Brussels. I was just curious because you talked a lot about economy and economic growth, and I just wanted to bring in the debate the issue of going beyond growth, and also maybe linking to the conversation that a lot of populists and a lot of resentment from citizens come from the fact that policies do not improve the quality of life of citizens, and we have based a lot of policymakers have based their decisions a lot on economic growth and not multidimensional ways of measuring progress in society. So there is this detachment from citizens' everyday needs. So I was just curious to hear your take, and how do you think we can look at measurement of progress in society and linking it more to the needs of citizens?
Thank you. Any other comment? Yes, we are 1 and 2, right? Okay, so, and could you keep note of this question? It's very important. Thank you.
Hi, Peter Rauschenberger from the municipality of Budapest. I just would like to make a very short comment about the normative aspect of all this. It is not just an empirical matter. I think from the point of view of the normative theory of democracy, I think we should understand that inequality is a failure from a normative point of view, and I'm not sure it is understood by mainstream liberalism even to this day. I mean that liberal democracy has a promise, and this promise is that it would institutionalize the moral equality of people. And frankly, in many ways, it failed to do so. Because if your life is reduced to fight for survival, then you are not an equal citizen. You are not on an equal footing in a democratic society with those whose lives are not reduced to fight for survival. If big businesses have privileged access to regulation, then you are not on an equal footing. You don't have political equality. And I don't think it has been understood. It is not just that many people for various reasons, became frustrated. I think it is a normative fact that our democracies failed to deliver on an essential promise, which is essential to the moral justification of liberal democracy. And of course, globalization is an ongoing challenge to the sheer possibility of delivering on this process. And I wonder how you see the European Union could be developed to be more able to help the EU countries to deal with this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, and then we have one more question, please.
Péter Molnár, former member of the Hungarian Parliament, and just I want to highlight that I think what Peter Auschenberger said, it's one of the most important points in the whole conference. And my question is whether you could agree that there may be a type of populism which is positive in the sense, which is about reaching out to people in effective ways, including emotional ways, but without excluding groups. What you mentioned, that then it's about exclusion. Without excluding, it's just also, of course, on economic issues, because there has been many important arguments during the debates about these things, that there is such a populism in order to compete with the populism which excludes groups as a basic part of it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have three very interesting and important questions, and we have a couple of minutes. So I would like to offer all three of you the floor to pick up some of them, or comment more than one. I think they are very straightforward. Not that you can easily answer in a few minutes, but anyway, who is going to start? Michael.
This is working, right?
Yeah, this works.
Well, I think I would like to start with the second one, because I fully agree with the story, right? This is the reason we might have not put this more clearly here, that at least my work as a political foundation, right, which obviously has a different motivation to do this, is definitely informed by that promise of an equal society that protects everyone and the fruits of its progress is distributed equally has not really been materialized. And it resonates with something I talked about when I was in Brussels for some time, and I kept having this conversation with the liberal bubble there, so to say, when I asked them, why do you think some Southern European, Italian worker, or Eastern European who now leaves its country is so discontent with the EU? And because they kept saying, why are they so discontent? There's free borders, you can go anywhere, it's such a progressive project, and obviously, yes, that's the progressive part of it, but they didn't have an answer why they're still discontent. And it's like, yeah, well, the promise of the EU accession is basically that you as a country who joins will converge to the level of the European Union. This is why we have the social cohesion funds, this is why we put so much money into this, right? And this, in some ways, often worked, right? You saw it in just on a basic level. You saw huge growth in Poland after they joined, but you didn't look at the Gini coefficient or the distribution of that growth, right? And this was detached, and that's why I always said that inequality should be something we should talk about, because it entrenches certain grievances in society which drives us apart at some point. As long as there's something to distribute, everybody's kind of happy it goes forward. But whenever there's nothing to distribute, again, and you have to take things away, and you do it from those who already have something not to give, don't wonder they're going to vote for someone who is against this. And this is a real grievance, right? This is something you need to address. And I fully agree, because I had these conversations with the center mainstream kind of politics bubble a lot, and they kept coming back to this. I said, well, you clearly miss a point here. And it's the same story when you ask them, why do you think people voted for Trump? And if there's no answer, you didn't ask this question. Because obviously it's so overshadowed by everything that was so wrong going on in that campaign, and how many lies Trump said. But this is not the conversation you should be having, right? It's that these groups in marginalized communities who had this feeling for a long time, and just somebody came along and said, I'm going to do it different, even though he didn't do it. So I agree here, and maybe coming to that first question, and it has to do with how we measured progress, right? As I just said, we just looked at growth, right? This is really good, but we didn't look at distribution. We didn't look at welfare. We didn't look at human development, so to speak. This is not how we covered it. So, and that's the question of distribution. And I think this would be responsibility of at least the Social Democrats, which haven't done this in many parts. But now coming back to this, that we need to do, because this is the difference when you change the distribution. The grievances go away, because that's what matters on the ground in terms of how much money you have in the bank and if you can afford your housing. So, and to conclude this would also be what I believe, how you described the populism that is positive in a sense, but that doesn't exclude, well, if you are definitional, you wouldn't say then it's not populism anymore. But I see where you're coming from. It's this idea that it actually what these parties and people in the policy development and those who make decisions are in line and understand the grievances on the ground. And this is also something that in many ways has been detached in many of the political circles. It might have to do with the acclimatization of it, of people actually not represented anymore, so you don't see these perspectives, all these things that contribute that the system hasn't really helped many of those vulnerable groups who are now really feeling it hard in these times. So.
Thank you. Daphne?
Thank you. Yeah, let me, this microphone is very odd. Let me combine question 1 and 2 and then conclude with a quick response to question 3. So to Pietro, I think you're absolutely right. And that is precisely the point that I actually tried to make in the beginning when I said it's not about macro indicators, but it's actually about looking at the micro level. So in simple terms, we have rich autocracies and we have poor democracies. We have poor democracies that actually do function, right? But we have some rich autocracies. You have wealthy countries that are not democratic. You have anti-establishment powers that are very strong in countries that have big indicators, right? So I do think that the micro level is important. And to bring in an additional point that is to your interest is the local level. There is also a lot of research at the moment about how there are increasing center-periphery divides and how various peripheral voters who incur the costs of various economic policies that actually may favor the center, right? Or maybe actually favoring growth as a whole, these targeted voters who incur the cost actually go and vote for anti-establishment or populist parties. We see this very much in Germany with the green and far-right, for example, cleavage emerging. We see it in many other countries as well. So these are important nuances we need to make. And to kind of come to your point as well about inequality. Of course, inequality is a terrible thing, and if it's a fight for your survival, that's obviously morally wrong in society, right? But we do also need to understand that it's not only those who fight for survival that are creating that are voting for parties that are eroding democracy, because actually these people are very few. That doesn't mean we need to forget them, of course not, but it means we need to look at it as a much broader, as a much nuanced phenomenon and understand the very micro dynamics that are contributing to it. Now let me come to your question, because it is one very dear to my heart and one that I have thought about quite a lot. Now why I am very concerned about populism wherever it comes from. Populism is an ideology and political vision that centers on a distinction between us, the good people, and them, the corrupt elites. We tend to mistake this as populism is for the people. Therefore, it must be good, it must be democratic because it's for the people. However, what populism actually does is it says that we, the people, okay, are the only way to make decisions, and it elevates the will of some people to the will of all the people, because there is no society that that there is one singular will and everybody believes it. So the concept of the people itself is misleading. There isn't such a thing as the people. We actually all here come from different social groups, we come from different backgrounds, we have different preferences. The point is not to polarize and exclude those with different political preferences. The point of a successful and healthy democracy is one that actually incorporates, that understands these divisions and makes everybody have a chance, right? Everybody. So this is why I think populist narratives are catchy sometimes, but they are not a recipe for political stability. Precisely because they are polarizing. Polarized societies are not healthy democracies, and this is where my concerns come from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zsuzsanna. Quick reply to the questions. The first one of Pietro's beyond growth. Shall we go beyond growth? I completely agree, but the point, one of the topics of the discussion is inequality. When we look at inequality, along with the size of the pie, the distribution of the pie, we are already going beyond growth. And of course, in the world we are living, one of the great challenges that we have is environment, and I think environmental indicators and sustainability indicators are, of course, extremely important. Overall, I think if I have to simplify it, I think that what we need to go beyond growth is the creation of decent jobs. Well, for decent jobs, I not only mean growth in the wage, which is something that we've been missing and I stressed a lot this morning, but also stable position, which allow certain stability. I think we need a change of paradigm. Again, I was quoted in before, Danny Roderick speaking about productivism. You have some sign of this in the what Jack Sullivan and the Joe Biden administration are doing in the US. The idea of moving, so we had the paradigm which was Keynesian paradigm in the 70s, then we had this what somebody called neoliberal paradigms or market fundamentalism, and now we are moving towards a paradigm in which policy are inspired by vision of the economy, which is trying to get more redistribution and have jobs with higher productivity and better jobs. The question of Peter, they are all of the same name here with different national exceptions. I completely agree. It's like increasing equality is a failure of democracy. I think that we need to read at that, at least through my lens of an economist, in what happened at the global level in the last 30 years. I think that globalization and the way in which Western democracy built this project has been, in a sense, part of the problem, as is one of the reasons why democracy now fails in delivering more equality, because globalization, the story of globalization is that you have a bigger, that's the Stopper-Samuelson theorem, it's the base of that. We open markets and we increase the pie, but the same theorem says we open the markets, we increase the pie, but we increase also the inequality. There are winners and losers from globalization, the marginalized that Daphne was mentioning before, and the more we open, the less are the benefit with respect to the cost, because the benefit of globalization that's in financial economics are a tax, and there is decreasing returns on reducing the tax. But that's a technical detail. The point is that what we've been observing is exactly that. The people who vote Trump in the US, the people who were voting in 2016 for the Brexit in UK are the losers of globalization. The low-educated individuals which have been more exposed by external competition coming from the opening of the markets. And there are very conclusive studies in economics on these sides. And the problem, just to quote Voltaire, I think it was Voltaire, was was speaking about the Holy Roman Empire as not being holy, for sure, not being Roman because it was divided in two, and not being no more an empire. In a sense, free trade agreements are the same things. They are not free because many countries are forced to do that. Those developing countries, for example, that signed the TRIPS in 1994, they are not about trade because they are about investment, they are about property rights, they go much beyond trade, and they're not an agreement because there is a disparity of force. I think we should rethink to that. The last question, I don't remember the name, but was an excellent question about is there something like good populism? I agree with Daphne in a sense, it depends on how do we define populism. If the definition of populism is minimalistic definition of Kasmad that I was mentioning also before about being mostly a political strategy which it's built on a contraposition between the good and the bad. No, it's like the elite and the people. I don't think that this can do any good. But is that the right definition of populism? You can interpret if you want the Roosevelt political agenda and policy agenda in the 30s in the US as a first ante-litteram populist agenda, and that was a good agenda. It was a pro-equality agenda, was a pro-good work agenda. So it's again, it's a matter of definition and outlook, I think. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think our time is getting over. We touched these very complicated and interrelated issues, which are basically we raised somehow most or many of the most important and unsolved questions of the world today, because it's not without reason. We do live in a enormous change. Our societies, the world is going through something unprecedented, at least in our livelihood. So I try to be a kind of realistic optimist, seeing world as a changing entity around, when as a Hungarian, there's many reasons to be upset day by day, but we are actually facing this very firsthand, all these changes and all these trials and errors, both including having this autocratic government and also our opposition, including political parties, civil society, intellectuals thinking all about these issues. I think if we look at our life like a big trial and error, we are on a good track, because this is what is happening to us. And understanding this nature of these profound changes, which are there and demonstrated themselves very visibly in 2008, and poly-crisis we are witnessing ever since. So it's obviously seems very complex, complicated, interrelated, and almost unsolvable, and a complete crisis of a liberal democracy is witnessed, tangible in this country. But of course, if we are in a crisis, that's always an opportunity to change, and I think this is how we have to see. And the whole conference is probably, as getting too slowly to the end, is about what to do with this, how to approach these changes, what are the entry points in this very complex situation. You cannot change everything at the same time. I think both the issues we've shortly discussed today, like inflation, I think was put on the agenda because of this is so very well measurable, right? It's easy to see. It influences our life on every day. Things are getting more expensive. And also, inequality, which has many faces, and we could not touch all of them, but obviously very evidently with us, and partly a reason behind the big changes in the world. So I would like to thank you all for coming and sharing your ideas, Michael, Daphne, and Piergiuseppe, and for your wonderful questions, and for everyone for your patience. Thank you very much.